Welcome to Phil and Ted's Sexy Boomer Show with your hosts, Phil Proctor and Ted Bonnet. Phil and Ted's guest today is radio and TV host, entrepreneur, progressive political commentator, and prolific author, Thom Hartmann. And now, your Sexy Boomer hosts, Phil Proctor and Ted Bonnet.
Welcome to Phil and Ted's Sexy Boomer Show. I'm Ted Bonnet.
And I'm Phil Proctor. And today we have a fascinating man who makes his living talking and will be talking with us about living. He's the #1 progressive talk show host in America. He's the one and many Thom. He's got a big Hartmann tag. You're it. Hi, Thom.
Yeah,
right, I know. You're not used to talking to real people, are you? Unless we call on the phone. Hey, Thom, why do you keep picking on the president? You know, he's not a bad guy. Played golf with him once, and he actually let me win. Right?
Hi, Phil. Hi, Ted.
Man, I tell you, I don't know how you do it, Thom. You talk occasionally about some of the other progressive talk show hosts. Mm-hmm. You featured a fellow, was his last name Thompson? No.
Joe Madison?
Yeah, Joe Madison.
Yeah.
And various other. But how many of you are there? How many of us are out there these days?
Probably 15 or 20, if you include the people who have a pretty good following on non-traditional platforms like YouTube or podcasts that are really burning up the pavement, on Spotify and Apple and things. There's 6 or 7 of us who are, on like Sirius XM or on major radio stations around the country. And Free Speech TV carries a lineup of people.
We talked with Harry Shearer that there was a turning point where right-wing radio replaced a lot of progressive FM and progressive thoughts.
That's right.
And that it's far more marketable.
Well, I don't think that that's an accurate characterization. When Air America started, we were on 57 Clear Channel stations. We were only leasing 2, New York and Los Angeles. All the rest of them picked us up because we got them ratings, good ratings. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when Bain Capital, Mitt Romney's company, bought Clear Channel, because we were on Clear Channel stations, they started taking us off. And we got down to like 3 or 4. I'm on, I think, 2 right now. Maybe just 1. Maybe just San Francisco. I'm not sure if the Albuquerque station is still up. And then Cumulus bought out the old CBS stations, and they ended up with the 700-800 stations. One of the senior executives at Cumulus, one of the 2 owners, one of the billionaire owners, visited with me and a United States senator in his office, and the senator said, well, now you own all these, basically a radio station in every major market in the United States. And he also bought Westwood One, which was the network that was syndicating all the progressive programming.
Huge.
And so this senator said, and you own the network that syndicates them, so how many stations are you going to put progressive programming on? And this guy said, none. And the senator said, why? And this guy said, because I will not have programming on my stations that is of people who want to raise my taxes. A couple of years before that, I had Talkers Magazine does an annual convention for people in the talk radio business. Typically draws 100 or so people, and they're all hosts, and 95 of them are right wingers. But it's an interesting event. And I like it. I like going to it. And I was at their luncheon, and I was just by coincidence sitting next to the vice president of programming, as I recall, for Salem Radio, which again owns radio stations in all the major markets, and carries Hugh Hewitt and Dennis Prager and all those guys. And I said, you've got nothing but conservative programming on. Why don't you put a progressive on? Me, or there's some other good shows too. And he said, oh, we'd never put a progressive on. And I said, why? And he said, well, our company started out as a Bible publishing company, and all our money comes from publishing Bibles, and liberals can't be Christians. We're a Christian company. And I'm like, I'm a Christian. I think I'm preaching Jesus's values.
Absolutely.
And he's like, oh no, you can't be a liberal and a Christian. Well, we would never put that on the air. So it's not that the radio stations just rejected it. I mean, if you go back to the late 70s and early 80s, it was what was his name? The guy who was broadcasting out of Colorado, who got, machine gunned by the skinheads. They made a movie out of it called Talk Radio. Alan Berg.
That's right, Alan Berg.
And you could hear his show in 27 states. I mean, he was a big deal, and that was early talk radio, and he was very, very progressive. But after he was murdered, just a couple of years after he was murdered, Rush Limbaugh came in with big money behind him, rolling it out on 50 some odd stations, and I think it's more the ownership. And I think that, in 87, Reagan stopped enforcing the fairness doctrine, which doesn't require a liberal for every conservative, but it does require programming, what's called programming in the public interest. And then in 96, Clinton blew up the ownership rules.
Yeah.
And that led to this massive consolidation of the media.
These are publicly owned airwaves.
At least in theory.
People have forgotten this.
Yeah.
Just to step back a moment, when you said about Romney, did Romney, when he bought the company and took over, did he eliminate the liberal programming ideologically or from a financial point of view?
Well, they always said that they had trouble selling advertising. I mean, that was always their shtick.
Yeah.
But, the fact of the matter is, I know I was here in Portland. I was on one of the Clear Channel stations. I did the morning show for 3 hours before I did my own nationally syndicated show. And this is when that station was an Air America station. And, we were selling ads just fine. Thank you very much. And right now I'm on some fairly large commercial stations, WCPT in Chicago, KTNF in Minneapolis. And there's one in KTRC in Santa Fe. And there are others, and they're doing just fine. It's the whole nobody wants to listen to liberals on radio and nobody wants to advertise with liberals. It's just BS. It's a story that they tell to justify, stripping the public airwaves of progressive voices.
Yeah, it's a false narrative. I want to go back also to one thing you said. You went to this convention. 95% of the talk show people there were right wing. Mm-hmm. And you were left wing. Did they make you sit in the left part of the auditorium? Now, you may laugh, but do you know that that's where left wing and right wing come from? Do you know that?
Assumed it had to do with how Parliament was separated.
No, it was during the French Revolution. Because they were so antagonistic towards one another, and of course, everybody had guns or knives, and they didn't even have to have a law about it. That was just the way it was. So they separated them. In this like horse arena, this armory. So that they could talk out some of their problems. And the liberals were on the left, and the radicals were on the right. The monarchists.
The times of Maximilien Robespierre, you mean?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's where it comes from.
Wow.
I love that.
I was watching you on RT and hearing ideas and news, and I thought to myself, here I am having to listen to a Russian propaganda arm to get news about my own country.
Yeah, that was an interesting experience.
Yeah, I was always wondered, how did you reconcile that? I mean, I would imagine it's for pragmatic reasons, but wasn't that an optics issue?
Well, when we started, there were a number of foreign networks broadcasting television in the United States. You had Al Jazeera coming out of the Middle East.
That's right.
You had RT, you had France 24. You had BBC, and RT had started as a network that was to promote Russia, give it a nice image in the United States. And for the first 5 years, all they ran was documentaries, mostly World War II documentaries. And, they figured out that wasn't working. And so, they hired some programmers and said, turn this into a real network. We want to compete with Al Jazeera and BBC. And so they did, and the guy that they hired, came to me and said, we'd like to give you a show. You do a really good job. And I said, I would only do this with contractual independence. I will not be an employee of the network. I will not have anybody who works for the network having any oversight over what I say or do on the air. I mean, you can take me off the air anytime you want, but no censorship, nothing, period. This is my show. And they agreed to that. Which impressed me. And I went and talked with, Michael Harrison, the guy who publishes Talkers Magazine. And I said, what do you think? Is this a good idea or not? I'm a little nervous about it being Russia. Mm-hmm. And he was like, no, there's all these networks popping up, all these foreign networks, and they're doing some pretty good journalism, and RT seems to be doing a pretty good job too. And during that period of time, that first couple of years that I was on, it was most of the programming was progressive, and I think that was because they were trying to fill a niche that was underserved. There wasn't progressive programming out there. They were counter-programming to Fox, I suppose, and they were just trying to grab an audience. Around the time that Trump started coming up, though, in 2015, 2016, we started seeing a shift in the news side, which had been just straight news up until that point of the network. And that was the point at which I gave notice. I had to give 90 days notice, but I gave notice to the network. And that was a year before my contract was expired, but it was when I had an opportunity to do it, and we bailed out. So, but during the time that I was there, they treated me very well, and I think I'm quite proud of the programming that we did. The network has changed quite a bit since then.
It was forced to register as a foreign agent in 2017.
Yeah, that was right around the time I left.
I worked at CNN at the Washington and the New York bureaus in the late 80s. Mm-hmm. CNN, when Ted Turner was still running it, was this happy place. We were there. We were the only ones doing it. And we really were interested in accuracy. There were boundaries, obviously, but we would get intelligence. We had our own pre-internet back channel. For example, when Noriega invasion happened, our people were looking in windows and seeing stacks of bodies in warehouses, although it was being reported as a bloodless removal. And we sent fax machines to Yeltsin so he could communicate during the putsch.
Wow.
And CNN ran the wire from Syria to Baghdad, so CNN was the only news outlet that broke Bush's intended blockade of information for the first attack on Baghdad.
Wow. This was 91?
Yes.
That's what made Wolf Blitzer's career, wasn't it? Because he was there on the ground?
No, it was Peter Arnett, John Holloman, and Bernie Shaw. And I was friends with Bernie and not so much Bernie, I wrote for him, but I was friends with John Holloman. I asked John a couple of months after it happened, I said, what the hell happened in that room? He said, well, we laid that line down 3 months before. And this White House was so freaked out that there was a way to report what he was about to do, that George Bush was on the phone with Ed Turner, who was not related to Ted, but was the head of the network. And the president was on the phone with Ed Turner for a half an hour before the invasion, trying to get them out. Bush kept saying, we can't guarantee their safety. And Bernie used to have dinner with Bush at the White House. So CNN called the Baghdad hotel room and said, the president's been on the phone for half an hour saying he's worried for you guys. You want to get out of here? And Arnett said, no, it's what I do. And Holloman was like, no, I'm fine. And Bernie said, I'll go. But it was too late. And then the shock and awe started. And the White House was furious because we were able to cover that.
Mm-hmm.
I think what started with the Reagan era took a long time to bear fruit. Do you see a long-term plan that's coming to fruition in this country from a Republican point of view?
Oh, yeah. Actually, I just finished writing a book about this that'll be out in the spring called The Hidden History of Oligarchy in America. In 1951, Russell Kirk wrote a book called The Conservative Mind that started a movement. This was the book that Barry Goldwater, that turned Barry Goldwater into Barry Goldwater. It was the book that turned William F. Buckley into the modern William F. Buckley. They all credit Kirk for this, by the way. Everett Dirksen. I mean, just a whole generation of conservatives, my father as well. And in 51, what Kirk said, essentially, he didn't say it quite in this language, but it's fairly clear when you read the book, that if first of all, he was decrying the socialism of Franklin Roosevelt, Social Security and things like that, and the rise of unionism in the United States, the union movement. And he said, if this middle class that has emerged, now this was really the first major emergence of a middle class in the United States since the 1770s. He said, if this middle class that is emerging in the United States gets strong enough, gets large enough and wealthy enough, and keep in mind, at that point in time, the wages of people making less than, in today's money, less than $50,000 a year were rising faster than the wages of people making over $1 million a year. The rich were not getting rich as fast as working people were getting wealthy. And so he said, if that middle class ever gets wealthy enough and strong enough, you are going to see some very specific and predictable results. Young people will lose their connection to the older generation. They will think that they know everything, and they will begin to rebel. Women will demand equality in the workplace and will no longer basically submit to their husbands. Minorities will be demanding their share of the wealth that white people have held in this country for 200 years. And the consequence of these, in aggregate, will be the destruction of America. This uprising that's going to happen once the middle class hits some, and he didn't define it, but hits some critical tipping point of wealth. That rebellion that's going to emerge is going to undo the American Revolution and turn the United States into a socialist tyranny. And of course, back then, socialism, communism specifically, was legitimately associated with tyranny. We were all watching the Soviet Union. And so, by and large, the media thought he was a crackpot throughout the 1950s. Most of your movement conservatives were kind of, they kept their head below, under the radar, below the radar. 1964 was their coming out party with Barry Goldwater. And Goldwater, of course, lost. In 1961, the birth control pill was legalized. And so by 1965, it was widely available. And suddenly women had control of their reproductive systems. And so they were demanding equality in the workplace, as Kirk had predicted. You had the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968. African Americans were demanding equality. In 1967, you had the anti-war movement, which is where most of my efforts were focused when I was a teenager that year, those years, and getting arrested and whatnot in the midst of all that. And so young people were rebelling. And at that moment in the late 60s, early 70s, these movement conservatives were able to say to all their Republican colleagues, because they were a small minority, see, we told you so. We were right. And if this continues, these hippies and these black people and these crazy women are, their phrase, Limbaugh calls them feminazis. These people are going to turn America into something that looks like the Soviet Union. And that happened about the same time that in 1976, the Supreme Court, in a decision called Buckley versus Vallejo, and then in 76, in the Buckley case, the Supreme Court, for the first time in the history of America, said that if a wealthy person, if a billionaire owns a politician, or even a couple dozen politicians, and they fully own them, they're fully responsible for this person's career, that used to be considered corruption. That used to be illegal. In fact, that used to be considered bribery when those politicians did things in the interests of the billionaire who owned them. Mm-hmm. And the Supreme Court in 76 said that's no longer considered corruption or bribery. That's considered free speech under the First Amendment. Money is the same thing as speech. And then 2 years later, in a decision called First National Bank versus Bellotti, the Supreme Court added corporations to that and said, if corporations want to own politicians, that's free speech. So that was 78. So that led to the Reagan Revolution. And the Reagan Revolution was the beginning of the takeover, the destruction of America, basically, the destruction of the New Deal, the end of Keynesian economics. And what we're seeing right now with Trump is the predictable endpoint of the Reagan Revolution.
He's the perfect symbol of it imploding.
Yeah.
It's remarkable that we're having a pandemic to further the revealing of all of this. Mm-hmm. I think some people are, like myself, are hoping for a healthy reboot. Are you at all optimistic that maybe we have some hope here?
One of two things is going to happen. In 1932, Franklin Roosevelt came to power, Adolf Hitler came to power, and the Great Depression was ravaging both countries. And these were both, democratic republics. Because of the leadership of those two people, those two countries went in very different directions. I think that we're at a very, very similar turning point right now. And I think that leadership is going to be the critical factor next year. And if Donald Trump gets reelected, I think the American experiment is over, and we will slide into full-blown strongman autocratic kleptocracy and tyranny. And I think that if Joe Biden is elected and we can reform the system and undo a lot of the neoliberal damage that was done by not just Reagan and the two Bushes, but also by Clinton and to a much smaller extent by Obama. But Clinton did some real bad damage to this system. If we can undo that and return to the kind of foundational principles of this country, we'll be in good shape. And it's going to be a hell of a fight because you've got not just the oligarchs in the United States who are supporting the right wing and Trump and the Republican Party, but now we know that Trump has reached out to China to help him. Russia is helping him now. We know that from the CIA and the FBI. They've said this out loud. Chuck Grassley, the Republican chairman of the Intelligence Committee, has said this, on live television. And as Seth Abramson has pointed out, and I was just reading another book just a little bit ago, also laying this out. It's not just Russia. There are oligarchs in Israel. There are oligarchs in Saudi Arabia, and the actual state of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. There are half a dozen other countries that have been throughout Trump's presidency that have been actively helping him and that are actively, working to see him reelected. And frankly, that's very troubling, and it doesn't get anywhere near the coverage it should get. These are not secrets. This is not some conspiracy theory. This is all right out there in the open to see. It's just that it very rarely, once it's reported, everybody goes, yep, okay, that's the story. Now let's talk about something else. Let's talk about his rally.
All the information that's come out about the Russian influence on Trump through his real estate deals and all the failures in the 90s or in the 80s that resulted in him not being able to get any bank loans. And if you just read a few books, you'll see that there's a fairly clear trail, an obvious connection to Trump and finances in Russia.
Yeah.
When you talk about reform, personally, I think unless the Citizens United is repealed, we don't have a chance.
Yeah, I agree. I've been reading Hidden in Plain Sight is the book I've been reading, and I'm sorry I don't have the name of the author. I can't remember her name right on the top of my tongue, but she's been on my program. She's brilliant. And it's about this.
House of Putin, House of Trump is a good book also about that subject.
Yep.
While we're on this topic, just to step back a few years earlier, you wrote a couple of books on the Kennedy assassination, the JFK assassination.
Mm-hmm.
You wrote about the mafia connections and all, but do you think that was, in a sense, a coup here in the country, and America's course of history forever changed as a result of that takedown of Kennedy?
I wouldn't call it a coup because it wasn't anybody inside government who killed Kennedy. It was the mob. This was their last gasp. When Kennedy was elected in 1960. Eisenhower and Nixon was the vice president of the United States at that time, were still insisting that there was no such thing as the mafia. J. Edgar Hoover was still insisting there was no such thing as the mafia because he was being blackmailed by Santos Trafficante. He and Clyde would go down twice a year to Hialeah, and Trafficante would supply them with young boys and money and liquor and stuff. And he had film of them, video of them apparently. And so Bobby came in as AG, and in 61, we went from 16 prosecutions in 1960, as I recall, might have been 17 or 18, but it was in the teens, of what you would call organized crime, to over 700 prosecutions of these guys in 1961. And they maintained that 500, 600, 700 every year. And they were putting people in prison, and they were holding hearings, and they were they were tearing the disemboweling the mafia. And so, the mob had to put a stop to that. And there was this famous meeting. I actually met with Trafficante's lawyer, who later wrote a book about this. He's passed away now, but he's in our books. But he laid this out in his own book. Jimmy Hoffa, Trafficante, and Marcello got together. Jimmy Hoffa had been stalking Bobby Kennedy in D.C. with a rifle, wanting to assassinate him because RFK was going to put him back in prison. The Sun Valley land deal, he had given Nixon a bribe in 60, and Nixon got the Justice Department to drop the charges against him. Well, JFK comes in and Bobby reinstates those charges. And so, Hoffa's looking at going to jail for years and years. So he's running around with this rifle, and Traficante sends a guy up and basically snatches him and says, no, you don't. And they get together down in Florida. And Hoffa has a suitcase with $1 million in it. And he opens it up and he says, I'll pay you guys this to kill Bobby Kennedy. And Traficante, thought about it for a minute and then turns and says, when a dog is going to bite you, you don't cut off its tail, you cut off its head. And they all understood that meant kill Jack, not Bobby. And that was when the decision was made. And, a little less than a year later, it was executed.
Right after the assassination, Hoffa's comment was, Bobby's just another lawyer now.
Exactly. They killed Jack to stop Bobby. And they did it in a way because Bobby was running this off-the-shelf illegal operation against Castro that looked like it was going to succeed. And they took a couple of people who had been in the middle of that. Bobby didn't realize that the operation had been infiltrated by the mob. And so they had a couple of people who were involved in that operation, one of them being Lee Oswald, and made it look like they were the ones who were involved in killing Kennedy. And so Bobby immediately thought that he was responsible for his own brother's death. And he continued to believe that for 4 or 5 months. We interviewed his closest friend and his lawyer. And you look at the pictures of Bobby in the first months, and he's walking around like he's got a ton weight sitting on his shoulders. I mean, he was just crushed by this. And when he finally figured out that the mob had killed his brother, he made that famous speech where he said that he was going to get to the bottom of it, and implied it was the mafia. And within a few months, he was dead in a mob-run hotel.
Wow.
I think as much as the Kennedy assassination changed America, I think that the more consequential assassination was Bobby. Bobby would have been that generation's FDR. He really would have changed America.
Yes.
He was the ideologue. He was the one who knew history. Jack was more of just a politician's politician.
True.
I mean, I mourn the loss of Jack Kennedy, but Jack was just kind of a machine, conservative, Democratic politician. Kennedy would not have been able to get Medicare and Medicaid passed. He would not have been able to get the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act passed. Lyndon Johnson used that assassination to shove those down the throats of the Southern Democrats who opposed him.
Yes.
His assassination got us to the moon for sure.
Yeah. Bobby was the real deal. And the loss of Bobby is incalculable.
Incalculable.
Wow.
And by the way, Ted mentioned Oswald's murder by Jack Ruby.
And Jack Ruby worked for Marcello.
Peter Bergman, at the time that happened, was working for the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and he was assigned to work with the head crime columnist there. And the day that they were transferring Oswald from one prison to another, when Peter was at his house, and he had left the room with the television in it, and his friend, the columnist, said, "Peter, you want to see a murder? Come on, hurry up. And he called him in, and sure enough, it happened. Why did he know? Because they had him in a hitman's hold. They had the 2 policemen were totally exposed him. They had his arms. He was totally exposed to be murdered. And bingo, he spotted it.
And Ruby, he ran a strip joint there, and he supplied girls to the police.
God, I tell you.
As well as liquor. So the cops were in tight with Ruby, not because they, were in tight with the mob, although many of them were, but specifically Ruby was.
Wow.
We're going to take a little break now while we think about our lives, and then we'll be back with more enlightening conversation from the one and only Thom Hartmann.
Where do rules come from, Mother? Where do we get them? Rules are very, very old, Bobby. They're like stories and poems. Men learned them before they had learned to write. But how did the first rules get made? You remember, Bobby, that we read from the Bible a big poem about how Grid planned the world? Yeah, he planned land and water and light and darkness and grass and animals and power lines. I remember. God planned the world so that we could depend upon it. God made the world so that the sun and the seeds and all the power lines would obey his rules. Did the sun and the seats and the power lines really obey rules? Yes, dear. That's how farmers and scientists and policemen can know when to plant their crops and when to expect them to blow up. Did God make rules for people too, Mother? God did make rules for people, son, but there's a great difference about the rules for people. For instance, you blow pot. Daddy and I get stinko. The sun and the seeds do not choose. They just obey their rules without knowing that they are obeying their rules. And that's the way you should obey your rules, Bobby, or I'll belt you.
You're listening to Phil and Ted's Sexy Boomer Show. To hear all the Sexy Boomer Show episodes and get your hands on our Sexy Boomer bumper sticker, visit sexyboomershow.com. Look for Sexy Boomer Show on Twitter and Facebook. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast right now by clicking the subscribe button in your podcast player. Back to Phil Proctor and Ted Bonnet and their special guest, radio and TV host, entrepreneur, progressive political commentator, and prolific author, Thom Hartmann.
Thom, how do you carry all of this information in that beautiful head of yours? How do you do that? You have such a fine sense of history. Just as a quick parallel, we interviewed Penn Jillette of Penn and Teller. He has a mind similar to yours. He has read everything. He remembers everything. He has a sense of history. It goes back to the Paleo-Jurassic era and what have you. So can I ask you the same question? Where do you find the time? Because you do what? How many hours of media a day? 3 to 6 or something?
3 hours a day, 5 days a week. Yeah.
3 hours a day, 5 days a week. Where do you find the time to do your research and to write your books, and to do whatever else you do in your life?
Well, it's pretty much all that I do, which is not a complaint. I like this. I think, if you were to ask somebody who was like really into model railroading,
yeah,
1,000 questions about railroads and the evolution of railroads and where they came from, and and model railroads and what's the difference between HO gauge and S gauge and O gauge, they would blow your mind with their knowledge because they love the topic. They're into the topic. I am absolutely fascinated by history. My dad wanted to be a history professor when he grew up. He, in his second year of college, my mom got pregnant with me, and so my dad dropped out and went to work in a steel mill, to provide for mom and me ultimately. And so he never got to be a history professor, which was his goal. But he had 20,000 books in our house. I built a room in the basement of my dad's house out of library shelves, and literally old library shelves. He got them from libraries closing down. And probably 30% of his books were history books. I mean, he was just an absolute screaming, flaming history junkie and infected me with that. And so I love this, and so it's not work for me.
Right.
I mean, Louise and I get up at 5 every morning, and between 5 and 9 we put the show together, and write a small piece that will get pushed out to buzzflash.com. And then from 9 to noon, I do the show. And then at noon, I have lunch. And then from 1 until 6, I write, because I've got this 2-book-a-year contract with BK right now.
Mm-hmm.
And then at 6, Louise and I watch Rachel Maddow's show. It's the only television, basically, that I watch. And then at 7, we go to bed, and rinse and repeat, and whatever the old thing is.
Rinse, repeat, right.
Yeah. But it's a real... I like it. It's comfortable. I'm happy with it. I've been doing it for quite a few years. And I'm not any kind of special person. It's no great Herculean feat. It's just, I'm doing what I love.
Focus, dedication, love. Got it.
Do you walk out to your deck and do primal screaming? Do you fear for your safety with the amount of hostility and anger there is?
I've kind of come to peace with it. Probably dying the way Alan Berg did would be preferable to, a year-long torturous cancer thing, which is what I watched my father go through. So maybe there's not that much of a downside, but and I get death threats. I get them with some fair regularity, and it's only occasionally that they come with enough data that I know that somebody's actually paying attention to me. Saw you at the corner of M and 13th at 2:00 yesterday. The next time I see you there will be a bullseye on your back. Those kinds of emails.
Oh my God!
But you do the best you can, and frankly, I don't think that there's a Democratic politician in America who's probably not hearing the same kind of stuff that I am. The hard right, from the Boogaloo Boys on down, have gotten so into their whole violent revolution thing, that it's weird out there. So, but you can't dwell on that. If you do, it paralyzes you, and then that's no value. How can you be useful then?
Can't stop. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's the same with the Firestone Theater, doing, anti-Vietnamese War satire at the time. And we've always been anti-establishment, if you will, anti-authoritarian, all of that. And we would occasionally get pushback. And of course, the main thing was we couldn't get on television. We were boycotted and blacklisted, really, censored. But because of our particular time, we could send records out, which were private. People could listen to a record in the privacy of their own home and get our ideas and build our sponsorship, if you will. And then once FM radio happened, suddenly our audience just blew up because we were able to be heard, in campuses, on private stations, because they're not going to play a half-an-hour record on regular radio. But the underground radio, yeah.
I did the all-night progressive rock show on WVIC AM and FM in '69, or maybe it was '68. And because it was the all-night show and I was playing album cuts, I played Firestone Theater. It was the individual segments, the pieces. I would use them as bumpers between long album cuts. So you were on the air in Lansing.
That helped because the Midwest was the place that we toured the most, and Procter and Bergman toured the most. The Midwest was kind of the center of. They accepted a particular kind of surrealistic, anti-authoritarian comedy, unlike other parts of the country. See, I call what's going on now a pandemic. You can make wonderfully clear arguments to people about why they're wrong, but ultimately, they're not going to listen.
Right.
It is threatening to them. And, you've been very good on your show about not stepping over a line in terms of people saying unsubstantiated things, to rile other people up and all that. And that's one of the things that that we enjoy about your show. We've been listening to you since you were on Air America in L.A. every morning. It was a lecture with Thom. Go to school with Thom. Your first class was Thom. And that's the way that I do it now on KPFK, listener-supported radio. But, it also, I think, requires a certain amount of discipline on your part, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's the counterweight to my ADHD. Routines are good for hyperactive people.
In the Wikipedia piece on you, or your bio or something, it says that you were thrown out of high school.
Right.
For what?
For publishing an underground newspaper.
You published an underground newspaper.
It was called The Jurist. And it was a little 4-page newsletter that my dad printed for us in our living room. He was the Horatio Alger Society was this book collectors group, and he was the secretary, and he published their newsletter. And so he published this for me, and it was filled with left-wing stuff that my father absolutely hated, but he so believed in the First Amendment that he printed this newspaper that got me thrown out of high school.
Wow.
Wow. It's a double-edged sword.
That's remarkable.
Yeah, it really. My father was an extraordinary man. He really was. They actually got a court order barring me from going back onto school property, which is how I was able to take a GED when I was 16 and then go right to Lansing Community College.
Wow.
Because I could prove that I couldn't finish high school.
You mentioned ADHD. I wanted to bring that up because you, in 1992, wrote a book about that subject and brought to national attention this hypothesis about why it's so prevalent in our society.
In the late 70s and early 80s, Louise and I ran a community for abused kids in New Hampshire, this one that we started, that we talked about earlier. And I would say the majority, if not all, of the kids who came in had one of these labels. Back then it was called hyperkinesis or hyperactive syndrome. And Ben Feingold had written this book, Why Your Child is Hyperactive, and I flew out to San Francisco and met with him, and we tried the Feingold diet and all this other stuff. And in 1980, I wrote a piece and published it in the Journal of Orthomolecular Psychiatry, suggesting that what these kids had was not the Feingold diet didn't work for us. It worked for one of our kids, that was it. What these kids had wasn't a food allergy, that it was the way they were born, and it was not a birth defect, that this was actually a trait, a characteristic that would be very valuable in some societies and in some cultures in different times. And that, we needed to start thinking of it as a difference rather than a disability and demedicalize it. And then in the mid 90s, when we were living in Atlanta, our son was diagnosed with ADHD. And the doctor, the psychologist who did the testing, because he was failing in elementary school or middle school. And the guy who was doing the testing sat him down in front of Louise and I and said, "Son, your brain is broken, and and we're going to have to give you some drugs to deal with it because you've got this, disease." And it just brought it all back to me, and you don't, yell back at yell at somebody you just paid $100 an hour to. So I went off and I wrote my first book on ADHD, which was just reissued, new and updated. In fact, this year I updated it quite substantially. It's called, ADHD, Hunter in a Farmer's World.
Yeah.
And my hypothesis in short form was that the three characteristics of ADHD, distractibility, impulsivity, and a need for high levels of stimulation, were all things that would be highly adaptive in a hunting-gathering society, but became liabilities when you settled down and had to stay on the farm and sit and wait for the wheat to grow. And in the industrial society is simply a reinvention of the agricultural society. Put this bolt on this screw over and over and over again all day long, or pick bugs off plants all day long. But there are places for adults who are hunters. In our society, the farmers end up as bookkeepers, but the hunters end up in show business. They end up as private detectives, sometimes police officers, sometimes the best, sometimes the worst, frankly. They end up well overrepresented in sales. Among entrepreneurs, it's probably 90%. If you want ADHD, look at Elon Musk, Steve Jobs. So, I wrote that book, and it's caught quite an audience. I've written several more since then about the topic.
You were a psychotherapist for a while, or?
When we ran the community for abused kids, I jumped through the hoops to get rostered as a psychotherapist with the state of Vermont. The only practice in that regard that I ever had, other than being the executive director of that program, I interacted with the psychologists and psychotherapists that we hired. And then later, when I started writing on ADHD, I did consulting work with a number of psychiatrists, psychologists, and psychotherapists.
Even earlier, the thing that fascinated me the most was you ran an electrical repair shop. You had a degree in electrical engineering from school. Is that correct?
I never got the degree. I dropped out of college. Actually, I got kicked out of college.
More newspaper work?
Getting arrested in an anti-war demonstration that leads to 4 days of shutting down the campus, and I spent 10 days in jail for it.
Wow.
But I was a ham radio operator when I was 13, and I started out studying electrical engineering. And so when I was 16, we started, I moved out of my parents' house when I was 16, moved out to East Lansing. Uh-huh. And I started this TV repair shop, TV and stereo repair shop in the back of a head shop, just as a way to make a little extra money. And we built that up to a nice little business over 3 or 4 years. We called it the electronics joint, and our logo was a joint with rabbit ears on it.
Oh! Sounds like you already were engaged with liberal ideas and to change society.
What was it that changed you from Goldwater Republican to where you've ended up? What was the inciting incident?
It was 1967, and it was the war. It was the women's movement, the civil rights movement. I mean, it was all just boiling in '67. I'd gotten this summer scholarship to go to MSU, and I was starting to have really bad knockdown, drag out verbal fights with my dad. I mean, he never laid a hand on me, but we would just yell at each other.
Wow.
And so I just said, screw it. And I left home and rented a room across the street from MSU's campus. Lived for a while, actually, in a kind of a crash pad. It was called the paper office. It was where the local underground paper was published. And Keith St. Clair, a guy that Timothy Leary had ordained 12 guys and sent them out in the world.
Mm-hmm.
He showed up at the paper office with some really good acid. And we got the minister of the Methodist Church involved. And we were doing these trainings on how to do acid trips using the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And then I got real involved with MSU SDS.
The Student Democratic Society.
Yeah. That led to jail.
Wow.
And I should add, by the way, within a year, I'd reconciled with my father, and we never again allowed it to get that personal. And that's part of why I'm so good, I think, at debating conservatives right now, is that my dad and I learned how to do that ourselves and did for the rest of his life.
The book that I mentioned earlier, How to Talk to Your Crazy Right-Wing Uncle, that's the philosophy of the book.
Yeah.
To find, how do we find a way to talk to one another and exchange ideas? Not so much like you want to convince somebody, but you want to lay out a case for it that might make a person with an opposing view think about where they're standing. So I'm glad to hear that.
There has to be a way to say, I totally disagree with you. I think you're wrong, and I think you're wrong in a way that hurts our country, but I still love you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Absolutely. That's right.
Yeah, I have some friends who are conservatives, people that I got to know, particularly when we lived in D.C., and they would come on my show regularly and debate me. And you have to see people as human beings first and foremost.
That's right. That's right.
The fractured conversation in this country, I think, is exasperated by the media landscape, which is fractured as well. And yet, you have 7 million weekly listeners. You have 225,000 YouTube subscribers, 150,000 Facebook followers, 120,000 Twitter followers, and you're a New York Times bestselling author. What is your take on the influence of media on political discourse in this country now?
Well, media models our dialogue for us. I think that's why Jon Stewart went to Crossfire and said, "You guys are hurting America," because their discourse had devolved to a caricature of debate. It was no longer debate. I mean, I used to watch Buckley's show with my dad. For that matter, we watched Joe Pine together. I mean, we would sit there and we'd watch these shows, and then afterwards we would talk about them, and sometimes we'd end up yelling at each other. but often, most times actually, we didn't end up yelling at each other. Those were the rare exceptions. But we've lost debate in this country. We've lost dialogue in this country. Now it's become people shouting at each other and not listening to each other. And so I try to recover some of that dialogue in my program, and I think that there's a deep hunger for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Sam Joseph, my collaborator on the book I've been talking about, we also did a play called God Help Us, starring Ed Asner as God, of course, and it's been touring the country. It also deals with the same kind of elements. God is upset because there's such divisiveness in this country. It may tear asunder his entire universe, the fabric of his universe. So he brings a talking head who is a right-wing talking head, a woman, and a left-wing talking head who is a man, who are famous. He has them fight like dogs in the show. And then he actually finds a solution to this debate.
As God would.
As God would, by making them switch their skins so that suddenly she becomes the liberal and he becomes the conservative. And then they begin to get a perspective of, the differences between them and how they might reconcile them. And God's final word is about love and about putting yourself into someone else's shoes, and in other words, some way to get out of the debate.
I should try that sometime. I should ask, one of my conservatives, like, Julio Rivera, who comes on the show regularly to argue with me. He's a big Trump supporter, to take my position and I'll take his position, and let's try to debate each other.
That'd be great.
Good idea. I'd like to know how that comes out. That's good.
Yeah.
You'll hear it if we do it, if I can make it happen.
And lastly, you've been a vegetarian since you were a teenager.
Yeah.
Was it a political reason or a health reason?
No, around the time that Keith St. Clair showed up with all that LSD was when the Maharishi was also around, and I took TM initiation, and which is Hinduism, and they were preaching vegetarianism, and in addition to that, there was a substantial movement inside the SDS group that I was hanging out with at Michigan State to stop eating meat as a way of protesting violence. Gandhi was still, in everybody's memory. And so I stopped eating meat in 1968 as a statement.
Penn Jillette has become a vegetarian now.
And he, like you, seems to have just a bottomless source of energy.
Oh, yeah.
And focus and a great sense of calm.
Yeah, I think it's important. I think it's actually the healthiest way to eat. I mean, you look at the Cleveland Clinic stuff and the movie Forks Over Knives, and it's pretty clear now that eating meat as a condiment, as a flavoring, or if you live in a northern climate, you need to store food, having dried meat, makes sense. But having it as the core of your diet is just asking for heart disease and cancer. I mean, it's crazy.
Mm-hmm. Are you vegan or vegetarian?
We are vegan, except that a couple times a year we'll eat some fish. And we just started doing that about 8 or 9 years ago. And then for a couple of years, we went back to just being rigorous vegans. And then this year, I had Omaha Steak Company advertising on my show, and they had salmon. And they said, hey, we can send you a case of this and you can talk about it on the air. And I was like, oh, okay. So I'm not sure I could say that I'm a vegetarian because I'm just not, it's just like I'm not my politics, I'm not my diet. I think maybe 4 or 5 times in the last 2 years, we've eaten fish. And outside of that, it's been entirely vegan. We don't eat cheese just because it causes heart disease and snot attacks. When I eat cheese, the next day I can hardly talk on the radio because I get all this mucus.
Yeah, that's not a good idea.
Exactly.
We should let you go because I know you have to go to a barbecue, right? but I can't thank you enough for giving us a chance to see the man behind the curtain.
Yes.
Okay?
As you see all this difficulty and challenge right now, anything you'd like to say to our audience as far as offering some hope?
The great lessons of history are that things generally, they may seem very dark for a while, but generally they work out well. The history of the United States is we've had all these crises. We had the crisis of the Civil War. We had the crisis of the Great Depression. We have this crisis right now, each one 80 years apart, by the way.
Ah.
And it seems like what comes out of these is a good and progressive future. So there's that, number one. And number two, what I would say to any other boomers is be sure to walk a couple miles every day. Louise and I have been absolutely religious about this. We just go out and we walk 2 miles every single day. And it is the physical and mental and emotional effect of that, the positive effect of that, I cannot overstate. It's so important. And it's the exercise that our bodies are designed for. You don't have to push yourself, you can go at your own pace, whatever it may be. We walk fast, but get out there.
I have to say that's one of the upsides of the pandemic here in Los Angeles. Whenever Melinda and I go out for our little walk, we see more and more people walking, more and more people bicycling, and I think people have kind of caught on to that. We got to get out of the house. Let's just go for a walk. And they find it tremendously therapeutic and mentally healing.
Yeah, it is. And actually there's a psychological upside to it. I wrote a book about this it's called Walking Your Blues Away, about treating PTSD in part by walking. It's much more complex than that, but yeah, walking is important stuff.
I think the name of your autobiography should be, I wrote a book about that.
There you go.
So 30 and counting, right?
Sure.
Right now in your own library.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations. Gosh.
Thank you, Thom, so much for your time, and thank you for doing what you do. It's such a great contribution and so needed right now.
It's my pleasure, Ted and Phil. Phil in particular. You made my teenage years so much better.
Oh, good.
You informed me in so many ways with Firestone Theater. The work that you were doing back in the '60s. And I remember the first time I heard your album, I was tripping. And it was quite an experience. And I was waiting for the electrician.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for having me on your show, and thank you for the great work that you have both been doing all these years.
It's very kind, and I can't tell you how happy I and my darling wife Melinda are to have you and Louise as personal friends.
Back at you.
And we will continue our friendship as long as we possibly can.
Amen.
We love you very much.
Thank you. We love you guys too.
I hope to meet you when we can both be in breathing distance again.
Wouldn't that be nice? Yeah.
Thank you, Thom.
Thanks, guys.
How about that?
Isn't he something?
Wow.
We're so lucky to have friends like we do, whose lives we can share with you, our listeners. And if you want to hear more, you can go to our website. Oh, hey, it's my secret agent. I have to say goodbye, folks, and take this call. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Hello? Jim, how are you?
You've been listening to Phil and Ted's Sexy Boomer Show, featuring Phil Proctor and Ted Bonnet, with special guest Thom Hartmann. Rules was written and performed by the Firestone Theater. Music by Eddie Betos and the Nervous Brothers. I'm A. Ernest Guy. Join us for the next episode of Phil and Ted's Sexy Boomer Show, produced by RadioPictures.com, the makers of fine podcasts for boomers. Okay?